Welcome. Eran Kaplan will be speaking on the film Shoshana. Eran Kaplan is the Rhoda and Richard Goldman Chair in Israel Studies at San Francisco State University. He received his BA from Tel Aviv University and his PhD in modern Jewish history from Brandeis. Before coming to San Francisco, he taught at Princeton, Cincinnati, and Toronto. He's the author of several books, including The Jewish Radical Right and The Origins of Israel. One of his most recent books is Projecting the Nation, History and Ideology on the Israeli Screen. In addition, he has contributed to articles on Haaretz and Tikkun magazine. It is our great pleasure to introduce Professor Eran Kaplan speaking on the film Shoshana.
Riva, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very, very interesting movie. Now, when speaking about a movie like Shoshana, first we have to think what kind of genre this film falls under. And the genre here is historical fiction. And there's a combination. There's history and there is fiction. Now, the movie is based on historical facts. The characters were actual historical figures. The romance at the core of the movie was a real romance, a real relationship between Shoshana Bochov and Tom Wilkin, the British police officer in Mandatory Palestine. And the historical events that are mentioned throughout the movie were real events that took place. However, this is historical fiction. So the relationship depicted in the film does not necessarily draw from historical sources, of which we have very little. But here comes the artistic imagination of the writers and the filmmakers who add a touch of drama and romance to the relationship that we see on the screen. We have to mention here that this is not the first time that we have a historical fictional account of the relationship at the heart of this story. Nearly 20 years ago, the very popular Israeli novelist Ram Oren published a book that deals with the very same material as this film. And it is clear that he took a lot of artistic liberty in describing the emotions, tensions, and feelings between these two characters as they unfold throughout time. Some historians who studied relationships between Jews in Mandatory Palestine and British officials, especially relationship between British servicemen and Jewish women in Mandatory Palestine, could not corroborate some of the stories related to the relationship between the characters. However, again, and I have to emphasize that, the events are actual events that took place. In fact, I would like to make the argument the movie Shoshana is an excellent description of the historical and social dynamics in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community before the creation of the state under British rule. And the movie does an excellent job at describing the various political and ideological forces in the Yishuv, their relationship with the British government at the time, and also the unique role of the British in the years leading up to eventually Israeli independence in 1948. And in my presentation today, I will not be examining the cinematic depiction of the relationship between Shoshana and Tom. I actually want to focus on the ideological and political issues that we find throughout the film and provide some more historical context and perhaps a better understanding of the various forces. Now, I've been studying these very sources and those materials for decades now, so I'm intimately familiar. But for people who are just watching the film, and may not have deep knowledge or extensive knowledge of the various figures and movements involved, perhaps more context, more background will be very useful when you are watching and hopefully enjoying this very interesting film. Before I deal with the ideological movements themselves, I'd like to open with a quote from the great Israeli novelist Amos Oz. In 1982, Amos Oz published a book called In the Land of Israel, which was kind of a travelogue where he went to different parts of Israel and reported on a changing Israel in those times. And the first chapter in the book, he returns to the neighborhood where he was born in Jerusalem during the British rule in Palestine, a neighborhood that over the years became an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. But it was not an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood when Amos Oz was born there. And here I'd like to share with you a few sentences that Amos Oz wrote about his memories from that neighborhood when he was a young child. And he says the following: during my childhood, Eastern European intellectuals and educated refugees from Germany and Austria used to live here side by side with the ultra-Orthodox. There were artisans here and scholars, trade union functionaries, national religious party hacks, and dedicated revisionists, clerks in the mandatory government and workers in the Jewish agency, members of the Haganah and the Irgun, youth from Beitar and the United Socialist Movement, and the Bnei Akiva, the religious youth movement, noted scholars, village fools, madmen burning with prophetic light, world reformers who would compose and dedicate to one another fiery brochures about the brutal realities of Zionism, or about how the Palestinian Arabs originated from the ancient Hebrews, or about the blessings of organic vegetarianism. Almost every man was a kind of messiah, eager to crucify his opponents and willing to be crucified for his own faith in turn. Of course, there's literary flair here, but Amos Oz touches on something profound. He captures the spirit of the Jewish yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine before the creation of the state. It was a small community, numbering hundreds of thousands of Jews. That's all it was. But the variety of ideas and ideologies and political commitments and beliefs was astonishing. And not only that, people were fully committed to those causes. There were no simple divisions when we think of the US today or of Israel today. We tend to think of the fundamental splits between red states and blue states, between supporters of Netanyahu or opponents of Netanyahu. No, Amos Oz is absolutely correct. The Yishuv consisted of thousands and thousands of political and ideological islands constantly clashing with one another. And it was simply amazing. And some of those clashes and some of those differences are on full display in the movie. So let's begin with Shoshana Borochov. And of course, we have to start with her last name, Borochov, which is a big tell because Shoshana was the daughter of Ber Borochov. And as such, she was the daughter of Zionist ideological royalty in many ways. Though one has to admit that when Shoshana, her brother, and mother came to Palestine in the 1920s, they were not royalty. They lived in actually great poverty in Tel Aviv for decades. But this is maybe also a sign of those times. So who was Ber Borochov? Ber Borochov was an Eastern European Jew. He was first and foremost a Marxist, and this was his first kind of ideological awakening. But he also fused his Marxism and his commitment to a proletariat revolution, and he was fully committed to those ideas with Zionism. And as such, he was one of the first Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe to create the formula of what we would call socialist Zionism. Now, before the 1880s, there were many socialists and Marxists, Jewish socialists and Marxists in Eastern Europe. And then starting in the 1880s, there were Zionists. But the two camps did not get along. The Zionists were committed to a national revolution, and the socialists and the Marxists were committed to a universal revolution that will overcome nationalism and national divisions. And in fact, some of the leading socialist Jewish groups in Eastern Europe, we can think of the Bund and others, were vehemently anti-Zionist from the very beginning. They refused to support a particular solution to the Jewish problem that will be detached from a commitment to a universal revolution. But Borochov made an argument against his fellow Marxists and socialists in the Jewish circles in Eastern Europe. And his argument was as follows, and he based it entirely on a Marxist materialistic kind of thinking and logic. His argument was that because of centuries of anti-Semitism, because of centuries of discrimination and exclusion of the Jews in Europe, the Jews did not fit within the traditional social structures of modern European society. They were outside the entire scheme. Therefore, they could not be part of the kind of material social divisions of society, which from a Marxist perspective could lead to a revolution. Therefore, the position of Borochov, and there will be others who will follow, like Nachman Sirkin and other Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe, was that first and foremost, the Jews have to create for themselves an independent society, ultimately an independent state, where they will create normal, advanced social and economic conditions. And once those are established, then they can pursue the universal values of socialism and create an idealistic socialist society that would join forces with socialist movements throughout the world. So from Ber Borochov's position, history for the Jewish people in the modern period should include a two-step solution. The first step was Zionism, the creation of an independent Jewish society and a Jewish state in Palestine, in an independent territory, followed by a universal socialist society. And this is the argument that he made, and he became involved in Zionist circles. He participated in some of the early Zionist congresses, and he began to amass young followers among Eastern European Jews who were committed to both of these ideals, both socialism and Zionism. And some of those figures are supposed to be very familiar to many of us. They included, among others, a young man by the name of David Green, soon to become David Ben-Gurion. And those young followers viewed Ber Borochov as their ideological and philosophical leader. And it would be under his influence that they would form the first socialist Zionist political party, Po'alei Tzion, both in Eastern Europe and in Palestine. Ber Borochov drafted the manifesto for this political party, and he was considered the intellectual leader for those young activists, and in many ways they followed in his footsteps. And so there was a direct line from Ber Borochov and then to David Ben-Gurion, and later of course, the creation of Mapai and the Zionist labor movement. So yes, Shoshana Borochov was the daughter of one of the most important early intellectual and philosophical figures in the emergence of Zionism. Now, Ber Borochov continued throughout his short life to be fully committed to Marxism and socialism in a manner that he himself described as a maximalist manner, meaning for him Zionism was a first step, but not the final step. However, after the First World War and after the occupation of Palestine by the British, Ben-Gurion and other young activists began to shift slightly away from the teachings and legacies of Borochov and came to embrace Berl Katzenelson as their new intellectual leader and kind of philosophical and moral authority. And under the leadership of Katzenelson and Ben-Gurion, the party would, in many ways, de-emphasize the full commitment to kind of Marxist principles and really place the commitment to national liberation as the driving force of Zionism, that from their perspective should always be accompanied by a commitment to social equality, social values, and the place of workers at the forefront of the national movement. So it became kind of a more, we can say, tamer form of socialism under Ben-Gurion and Katzenelson, but still the legacy of Ber Borchov continued to inform socialist Zionism well until the 1960s and even 1970s. But the movie does not take place in those early years. It takes place during the British occupation in Palestine. And really the focus of the film starts in the mid-1930s into the late 1930s, at a time that we now call the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine, and the outbreak of violence in Palestine that was started by the Arabs and led to great turmoil and would eventually lead to the plan to partition Palestine and to create two states in Palestine. And during that time, the Jewish paramilitary groups in Palestine becomes very prominent, and it is those organizations that really are at the center of the film. However, those organizations were not detached from the political and ideological movements that defined the political contours of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine. And the conflicts between those groups and ultimately with the British has much to do with these early ideological divisions and movements that emerged. So, after the First World War, when the British established their rule in Palestine, the Zionist socialists would emerge as the dominant political force in Palestine, and their leader, David Ben-Gurion, would emerge as the de facto leader of the Jewish community in Palestine and eventually the entirety of the Zionist movement. And throughout those years, Ben-Gurion continued to be committed to what he called the constructivist socialist vision, meaning putting an emphasis on building social structures, social and economic infrastructure, building a society that is led by workers, that is committed to Hebrew work, as a way to prepare the way to political independence. From the point of view of Ben-Gurion and the laborites, political independence could only be achieved once a healthy society is in place. Therefore, they always preached caution. They said, we cannot rush towards independence. What is the point of achieving political independence if we are not prepared to be independent? If we cannot support ourselves, if we cannot be autonomous, if we will have to rely on outside forces to finance us and keep us alive, then what's the point of this political independence? Therefore, the efforts should be made on building the economy, building factories, building the agricultural center, creating enough jobs, creating enough infrastructure to support what they would hope would be mass waves of Jewish migration that eventually would be able to sustain an independent country, especially in a region that proved to be very hostile to Zionist and Jewish aims with regard to Palestine. And the institution that they created, and which would play a crucial role in preparing the way for the building of the social and economic infrastructure in Palestine was the Histadrut, which was founded in 1920. And the Histadrut was the Union of Labor Federations, but it wasn't simply a union labor. The Histadrut was both the biggest employer in the Jewish community in Palestine and also represented the majority of the workers in Palestine. And some of the biggest companies in the Yishuv, later on the State of Israel, like Solel Boneh, the construction company, Nuva, and many others, were part of the Histadrut. And the labor movement both controlled the Histadrut, both helped build the economy and social and political structures. It also aided the workers, provided for the workers, and it also led the political establishment. And they were the dominant force in Israeli politics. And as we see throughout the film, Shoshana was a worker in the Histadrut, like many other young Jews in mandatory Palestine. But there were opposition forces, and Amos Oz mentioned one of them, and they would become the main opposition to the laborites in mandatory Palestine, and those were the Zionist revisionists. They were the disciples of Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who would found the revisionist movement as a political party in 1925, but who already emerged as a prominent Zionist leader during the First World War. And Jabotinsky's worldview differed from that of the laborites in one fundamental manner. From Jabotinsky's point of view, Zionism should be committed to one goal and one goal only. And that goal was national independence, which, as far as he was concerned, should be achieved immediately. Here I want to share with you a text that Jabotinsky wrote in the 1920s. It is called Shatnez. Shatnez in Jewish law from the Bible is the mixture of wool and flax, which is forbidden. It's a non-kosher type of material that one should not wear. And in the article Shatnez, Jabotinsky made the following argument, which I will share with you now. He said the following: since Zionism today is an abbreviated and watered-down version of itself, it cannot be the only reigning ideology among our young people. You cannot whip up enthusiasm in people for a worthless thing, for they will turn to other ideals. This is why young people become leftists and seek socialist revolution and other ways to right social wrongs. And they try to connect these aspirations to Zionism. The result of this mingling is that Zionism has become a shorter version of itself, a conditional Zionism. The rescue of the Jewish people is no longer a goal in itself. It is only a means, a channel, an instrument, or a way of teaching other nations morality, etc. Hence, the Jewish national home should be built by other means, communist or proletarian, or whatever you call them, without capitalism and without exploitation. All this is fine and dandy, but what if it turns out that this is unrealizable? And this was the core critique that Jabotinsky leveled at the laborites. He was telling them, you cannot be committed to two ideals. You cannot fuse socialism and Zionism. He said, maybe when the Messiah comes, we can all become socialists. But in the meantime, we have to be fully committed to national liberation. This, for him, was the only goal of Zionism. And how does one achieve a full commitment to national liberation? You fight for it. And from the very beginning, Jabotinsky was an advocate of Jewish militarism, of the building of independent Jewish power in Palestine as a means to attain national independence. In fact, this is how Jabotinsky came to the fore of Zionist politics. With the outbreak of the First World War, he lobbied the British to allow for the creation of Jewish units that would fight with the British army against the Ottomans, who at that time controlled Palestine, and participate in the liberation of Palestine, which from his point of view was the only way for the Jews then to lay claim to Palestine and hope to have political independence. The early efforts at building Jewish units proved disappointing. There were some Jewish units, but they participated in failed battles in Gallipoli and elsewhere. But then towards the end of the First World War, new Jewish units were created. And Jabotinsky, but also David Ben-Gurion, took part in the final battles that the British held against the Ottomans in Palestine. So Jabotinsky, from the very beginning, emerged as an advocate for Jewish militarism as the path for political independence. When the war came to an end and the British established initially martial law in Palestine until 1922, Jabotinsky believed that the Jewish military units should remain independent and become the nucleus of a future independent Jewish or Israeli army. The British refused to allow those units to remain independent. And when they found out that Jabotinsky was acting to keep those units alive, he was put on trial and sent to jail. He would then be released after a few months as part of a general amnesty. But from the very beginning, the British viewed Jabotinsky as a potential threat, and his ideas about militarism were seen as dangerous for British interests in the region. But this was the basis of the initial split between the revisionists and the laborites. Now, just to fill in the gaps, while the Jewish military units that were part of the British Army were disbanded, the Jewish community in Palestine did establish a clandestine Jewish paramilitary force in 1920 called the Haganah, the defense. Now, the Haganah would emerge in the 1930s as a major organization, but throughout the 1920s, it was a minor organization that consisted of a small number of volunteers. It was poorly funded, they had very few arms, and they mainly provided some kind of protection, guard units, for remote Jewish communities far away from the major urban centers, but they had very little influence and very little impact. But for the revisionists, this was never seen as enough. And Jabotinsky created not only a political party, the Revisionist Party, he also founded a youth movement, Beitar. The name Beitar was also referenced by Amos Oz in the snippet that I read to you. And Beitar viewed itself not simply as a youth movement, but as an organization meant to prepare young people to become future soldiers. So members of Beitar regularly learned martial arts and basic military training, and they viewed themselves as future soldiers. Here again, they were very different from the laborites, whose own youth movements, and they had several youth movements, were committed to building new agricultural communities and for training Jews to become farmers and laborers. So here again, we see this fundamental division and fundamental rift between the two movements. As I said, the laborites were the dominant political party. The revisionists were members of the opposition. But the tensions were great, and battles took place regularly between those two movements. And throughout the 1920s and into the early 1930s, there were regular outbreaks of violence between laborite and revisionist activists. Many of them had to do with labor issues, with strikes, and the powers of the union. And those tensions were so great to the point that in the mid-1920s, the British authorities in Palestine believed that the greatest threat to public safety and security in Palestine was not the Arab-Jewish conflict, which in those years was not a major issue, and there were very few violent interactions between Jews and Arabs throughout most of the 1920s. They actually believed that the greatest threats for instability were the tensions between the laborites and the revisionists. And we know that from reports that British officials in Palestine sent to the British government back home in London. So I said that throughout most of the 1920s, the Haganah was a small, minor organization with few activists, volunteers, and that most of the tensions between the laborites and the revisionists tended to focus on the labor market and the power of the unions. But this would all come to a crushing end by 1929. In August of 1929, Arabs attacked Jews in the old city of Jerusalem. Soon the violence spread to the city of Hebron, where nearly 70 Jews were massacred. And these would be the most violent attacks against Jews in Palestine until to that date. And this would bring the conflict between Jews and Arabs really to the forefront of life in Palestine. This led the Zionist and Jewish leadership in Palestine to realize that they need to strengthen and bolster the Haganah. They realized that they needed their own means to protect Jewish communities, and that they cannot simply rely on the British police, who was very late and very ineffective in the early hours of the violence that broke out in August of 1929. And here again, the laborites and the Histadrut would take the lead, and they would dominate the Haganah, and they were the ones who put in the funds, manpower, and political clout into developing the Haganah. But the revisionists grew impatient with the laborite leadership and their approach. They believed that a much more proactive approach with regard to the Arab population and eventually the British must be taken by the Zionist leadership. Here again, they were heavily informed by the teachings of Jabotinsky. Perhaps the most famous article that Jabotinsky penned was the article that he wrote in 1923 called The Iron Wall. And the title says it all. From Jabotinsky's point of view, the only path to Jewish independence in Palestine was the creation of an iron wall, meaning a strong Jewish military force. He envisioned that there will be a national conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. From his point of view, it was inevitable. It will break out. And in order to prevail and gain independence, the Jews must commit everything to building their iron wall, their impenetrable military that will provide independence. The laborites viewed things differently. They believed that the Haganah should be part of the overall strategy of the Jewish community in Palestine. It should defend Jewish communities, it should protect the Jews, but this should not take away from other efforts and initiatives, the building of more communities, strengthening the economy, creating conditions that would help absorb more and more immigrants, and also continue to cooperate with the British authorities. Because however frustrating the British authorities proved to be from time to time, still Ben-Gurion and the laborites believed that the only realistic way to eventually gain independence is through cooperation with the British Empire, who ruled Palestine and large parts of the Middle East, and that without that support, it would be simply unrealistic to expect that an independent Jewish state could be created in Palestine. Now, all those issues became very relevant by the mid-1930s when violence in Palestine, initiated by the Arabs and their leader, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, swept Palestine. And by 1936, there was an all-out Arab revolt against British rule and against Zionist aspirations in Palestine. And at this point, the Haganah needed to provide protection to thousands of Jews who were now the subject of ongoing violence in Palestine. And here again, the dominant line of the Laborite Zionist leadership was that the Haganah should stick to its name, defense. It should defend the Jewish community, but it should not become a force that initiates activity or violence. Rather, it should remain in the background and cooperate with the British in order to bring security and stability. By this point, the revisionists in Palestine and outside of Palestine decided that they cannot accept this type of leadership and this course, and they would split from the Haganah. And in 1937, some of the revisionist members of the Haganah left and created the Etzel, the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi. In English, we tend to refer to it as the Irgun. And they began to operate independently of the Haganah and carry out their own operations. And at this point, they began, among other things, to carry out revenge attacks against Arab civilians. And if you will notice at the beginning of the movie Shoshana, there's a reference to one of those attacks, which led to the first execution of a member of the Irgun by the British in the late 1930s. And so what up until this point was mainly a political and ideological difference between the two camps now became also a fundamental difference between two organizations. The much bigger Haganah, which tended to follow the traditional path put forward by the socialists from the very beginning of the 20th century, and the now much more radicalized Irgun, which followed the teachings of Jabotinsky and wanted to be fully committed to the military struggle for political liberation of the Jews in Palestine. And it became much more extreme than that, because now the younger generation of the revisionists, they became impatient with Jabotinsky and the older leadership of the revisionists themselves. They felt that they were too detached, that they were literary figures, they were intellectuals, and most of them lived outside of Palestine. By the mid-1930s, Jabotinsky couldn't even visit Palestine anymore. He was prevented from doing so by the British. And they felt that they wanted a more activist leadership, and a new generation of revisionist leaders would come to the fore, challenging in many ways the older generation, including Jabotinsky. And two of those leaders were very charismatic members of Beitar, the revisionist youth movement, and it would be Menachem Begin in Poland, and in Palestine, it would be Avraham Stern, who was a revisionist activist, a member of the Haganah, who would now become one of the leaders of the Irgun. And here I want to share with you a text that was composed by Avraham Stern that can give us a flavor of the kind of the ideological fervor and commitment of this younger generation of activists that emerged onto the scene. And here are some of the things that he wrote. This was in 1942. You can have nothing more noble and sacred than a national war. the war of a nation to safeguard its dignity, liberty, and life. The life of a nation without dignity and without liberty is no life at all. This is why any self-respecting nation, either big or small, is willing to take its destiny into its own hands and wage a national war, the course of which will be determined by the nation's readiness and its determination to fight against all odds, to be killed rather than to surrender. Even if these immeasurable values do not always predict the outcome of the war, they nevertheless determine its historical significance, its value to the fate of the nation, whatever the outcome may be. So here we see a full commitment to the idea of war and national struggle as defining characteristic of the movement. And this became the sentiment of now the leaders of this Irgun, this paramilitary organization, which was the political heir of Jabotinsky's Zionist revisionism. And so two very distinct camps, the laborites and the revisionists, and now they have two distinct military organizations carrying out their policies and political vision. And then, 1939, of course, war breaks out in Europe, and now Great Britain is fighting Nazi Germany. And this created a dilemma for the Jewish leadership in Palestine. On the one hand, all of them were frustrated with the British, especially by May of 1939, when the British issued a new white paper that would severely restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. But at the same time, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, the greatest threat to Jews in history. And the decision of Ben-Gurion and other leaders in Palestine was, as long as the British are fighting the Nazis, they will do everything in their power to support the British in the war effort. They will stop any type of activity in Palestine that could divert British attention from the utmost important struggle, and they will cooperate fully with the British. And the leaders of the Irgun, David Raziel, who was the commander of the Irgun in Palestine, signed on and agreed to this approach and to full cooperation with the British. But there was a small group within the Irgun who refused to stop the battle against the British, and they were led by Avraham Stern, and they would create a splinter group, Lechi, Lochamei Cherut Israel, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, who will continue to carry out operations against the British throughout the Second World War. Not only that, from their point of view, if the Germans, the Nazis, are fighting the British, then they would like to make a deal with the Nazis and join forces with them, because from their point of view, the real goal is to get the British out of Palestine as a way to attain full Jewish independence. And at that point, Avraham Stern becomes the #1 wanted person in Palestine, with the entire British police force committed to capturing him. And as you will see in the movie Shoshana, this is really part of the most dramatic element in the story, is the capture of Avraham Stern and the ramifications that it will have for the British officers in Palestine and for Zionist and Jewish activists. I will just add and go back to the quote that I started with by Amos Oz at the incredible tapestry. When the Lehi split from the Irgun, some of the people who joined Lehi were not only revisionists, some of them were actually radical Marxists and leftists who joined Lehi because they viewed it as an anti-imperial fighting force against capitalist interests in the Middle East. And one of them would actually emerge to a leadership position of the Lehi after the killing of Avraham Stern. There'll be three leaders of Lehi who would emerge. Israel Shaib, who was a radical revisionist in the tradition of Jabotinsky. Yitzhak Shamir, a future prime minister of Israel. And Natan Yalin-Mor, a Marxist who, in the first Knesset, pledged his allegiance to the Soviet Union and for a proletariat revolution, which he hoped would come very, very soon. So yes, all those incredible characters were there in the Yishuv before the creation of the state, and so many of them make it into a movie that I think does an excellent job at describing the kind of the ideological and political background that existed in the Jewish community in Palestine before 1948. So I hope you enjoy Shoshana.